Hi everyone, my name is Wyatt Cheng. I work as a senior technical game designer at Blizzard Entertainment. Thanks all for coming. Just a couple of reminders as normal. If you have your phones, just make sure to silence them. And they'll be, make sure you're scanned on the way in. Fill out the eval form when you're done. That's how they decide, who to bring back next year. So let's get started. My title today is Through the Grinder. We're going to go over a bunch of systems in Diablo 3. We'll talk about it. A little bit about Diablo 3. Came out on May 15th of 2012. That's last year. It's sold over 12 million units to date, which is great. And one of the comments and praise that we get most about the game is the combat. People are constantly commenting that the combat feels visceral, and it's enjoyable, and it's tactical. For today's talk, I chose to go in depth about 3 systems that were designed to support that combat depth. Those systems are going to be health recovery, command input, and skills. And I'll try to tie it all together to show how these systems work together to support that visceral combat feel that people talk a lot about. There's a theme that goes through my whole talk, and that's one of iteration. I really want to emphasize this, that design requires a lot of iteration. This is known by anybody who works in the industry, that we're constantly iterating. And I thought it'd be really fun to kind of go through a lot of the early iterations on these systems. You can kind of see how we failed, how we made a lot of mistakes, what we got wrong, what we learned. Those are all kind of my favorite things to do when I'm talking to other designers, is kind of go like post-mortem style. Iteration requires what we call avoid the grand reveal. That's one of the design values at Blizzard. At Blizzard, we have a set of design values that we all share. And this avoid the grand reveal is this idea that creative types really don't like showing their work to other people. Whether it's you're a writer or an artist or a designer, we're never really happy with our own work. And it's important as part of the iterative process that we show what we're working on to other people. And sometimes it's because, I'm not happy with it, so I don't expect you to be, so I'm not going to show it to you until I'm happy with it. Or maybe it's, I don't want you to think less of me, or I'm going to be embarrassed, or I'm not proud of this. These are all sorts of reasons why, and you have to fight against that instinct. That's a very natural reaction as a creative, and we need to basically create these environments where it's safe to fail. And this is kind of a thing that gets thrown around a lot in creative industries. So we really want to think about how do we create workplace environments where it is safe to fail, because that supports this sharing and iterative process. So like I said, we're going to go over 3 different systems. And the first one is the health recovery system. So to talk about the health recovery system, let's take a look at what Diablo 2 is doing, where we are making a sequel. And we sat down to work on Diablo 3, and we thought, we really want tactical combat. And we had to think about what are the steps that we need to take to create a more tactical combat system and a more tactical combat experience for the player. And one of the areas that we identified was this potion spam that was happening in Diablo 2. Normally you would drink a potion and it would heal you up to full, and a lot of the gameplay revolved around just drinking lots of potions, and your belt would hold up to 16 potions. And we really felt that this, access to unlimited healing was causing a problem. I mean, not only does the player have, access to healing, which is, at a first order, pretty obvious, but it also diminishes the use of, damage reduction abilities or debuffs on enemies or crowd control skills. Like, there's another number of other skill options that we really wanted to see as part of your combat experience that's diminished when the player has access to unlimited healing. Let's talk more about this tactical combat, which really relates to combat pacing. And one of the realizations we had is that healing and monster damage are 2 sides of the same coin. If the player has access to more healing, then the monsters have to do more damage to threaten the player. If you have a lot of healing and not a lot of damage, then all of your content feels trivial. If you have a lot of damage and not a lot of healing, then the content feels punishing. So those 2 really need to be kept in sync with one another. And since the player has access to large amounts of healing via health potions in Diablo 2, that also resulted in very large amounts of spiky damage. Spiky damage is this instance of this damage that comes out of nowhere and one-shots you. And that's really how a lot of players wound up dying as you progress farther in the game. Through a lot of play testing, we established that we really like this idea of there being about 3 to 5 seconds to go from full health to dead. I'll kind of show you what that looks like. So here's a video of our monk running around in the outdoor world. And he sees a little bit of danger, and he takes a little bit of damage. And for those of you who haven't played Diablo 3 before, the health globe in the bottom left represents your health. And you can see as the monk is fighting, the monk is taking some damage and the health pool is coming down. But there's a lot of time to go into that situation and really figure out what's going to happen. You know, that 3 to 5 seconds is critical to recognize the danger, assess the situation, and react accordingly. And this is kind of what we really came on to as we said, you know, we have to create monster damage, pacing, and healing rates that support this philosophy. Here's what it looks like when the damage is too high. This is what we were calling, you know, spiky damage. I walk in, I'm taking huge amounts of damage, and I die, right? And it's pretty obvious and almost humorous sometimes, right? You kind of, you know, chuckle that, you know, of course, now who'd want to play that game? But, you know, at various points during development, and even at various points during live, this is what it looks like. And that's what happens when the player has access to large amounts of healing and large amounts of damage. You know, if you're working on a dev team right now and you find that, you know, you have large amounts of spiky damage, I'd probably step back and maybe take a look at your healing mechanics and decide whether or not, you know, evaluate whether or not those are too potent. Just, so yeah, just dying over and over. So let's go over some of the iterations that we went through to solve this healing problem. The first iteration that we took was this notion of potion dilution. This is an idea that we threw out really early on. It was, you know, we kind of came from looking at Diablo 2, and we said, what if every time I drank a health potion, the next potion was reduced in effectiveness? You know, 75%, 50, 25%. The idea being maybe if I knew that my health potions weren't going to heal me for as much, I'd be a little bit more frugal with my potions. And I'll say right now that we weren't totally thrilled with this solution as we're putting in, but we did it anyways, and that's part of iteration. Like I said, we have to avoid the grand reveal, and we have to be willing to fail. And we knew that even though this might not be a solution that we were willing to ship with, it was something that was going to teach us a lot more about the problem. And, you know, teach it did. What we wanted was for players to be more frugal with potions. What we got was even more potion spam. I mean, if you think about it, if my potion's only going to heal me for 25% the regular value, I'm just going to drink 4 times as more. That's kind of the player reaction. One of the big lessons we learned from this is, you know, sometimes like diminishing returns or, you know, soft limits aren't always a good idea, particularly in a case where there's, you know, a fast-paced combat situation, and I have to make a decision between whether or not to drink a health potion based on, you know, a potion dilution scaler that's going to happen later. You know, that's simply not going to happen at this high-paced action pacing. So that obviously that didn't work. So we stepped back a little bit and we said, what are we going to try next? And we tried what we call non-combat regeneration. So this is a little bit of an idea that we borrowed from WoW. So World of Warcraft was out at the time, and for those of you who played, there's a notion of being in combat and being out of combat. If a monster is aware of me, then I'm in combat. And if there's no monsters around that are aware of me, then I'm out of combat. And that sounds pretty cool. So here's what that looked like. So here's my monk again. I'm running through the dungeons. I get locked in combat with one of the cultists. Again, in the bottom left corner, you can see I'm starting to take a little bit of damage. But as soon as I kill that last cultist, I'm no longer in combat, and I automatically heal to full. This is achieving a lot of the goals that we set out earlier. 3 to 5 seconds of combat pacing. You can kind of imagine if there was 5 cultists around me, I'd probably be in a lot more trouble. I have to play a little bit more strategically. If I'm in combat, I really have to watch how much damage I think I'm going to take. If I'm out of combat, I'm safe. I get to heal back to full. Very promising. Had a couple problems. So the first problem we had is as we started to play test this, you know, the game more and more, and we were using it in real situations, here's what Diablo 3 looked like at one point. I'm running through the dungeon. I'm fighting a bunch of cultists. I'm starting to get low on health. You know, I'm like, you know, I should probably try to heal up. Except there's more cultists coming at me from off screen. Not to mention, in an action RPG, if I'm locked in combat nonstop for 5 minutes, that's actually a really good thing. You know, like I don't want the mechanics requiring me to deliberately drop out of combat. Here's another problem that we had. Again, I'm damaged, I want to heal. So I kill the last monsters that are with me, but I'm not healing yet. You know, what's going on? I come around the corner and I realize, oh, there's some monsters on the other side of the jail cell behind, you know, maybe possibly off screen that were aware of me but couldn't path to me, so they were locking me in combat. If you think about this sort of World of Warcraft perspective, like the monster distribution in World of Warcraft sort of has, you know, monster, empty space, monster, empty space. And it has this nice pacing that allows you to go in and out of combat. But in Diablo, it's not like that at all. We have monsters all over the place. We're an action-based RPG. We want to keep the action going forward. So this idea that I'd want to actually drop out of combat was, you know, not relevant for us. It didn't work. And we needed it to be really obvious when you were in combat and when you weren't. It was unacceptable that a monster could be underground or flying or stealth or off screen that would be keeping me in combat, because that was my core healing mechanic. But if you remember that first video I showed you, where it kind of showed a lot of promise, so we wanted to explore the idea more. So the next thing we tried is what we call defensive regeneration. Here the idea is, if 3 seconds pass without taking damage, then slowly heal back to full. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because we had a in-combat, out-of-combat system. It had a lot of promise, and maybe it's just the rules weren't right. It's also made a lot of sense to us because there's a lot of FPS games. In fact, most FPS games do exactly this. You know, you're out in the world, you're taking a lot of damage. It works so well, in fact, that some FPS games get away without even a health bar at all. They, you know, set the edges of the screen to be red. You hear your heartbeat, heavy breathing. These are all cues that you're taking a lot of damage. So what do? You just back off a little bit, try to avoid taking damage for 3 seconds. Then, you know, those cues stop. You know you're back at full. You get back into the action. And we know FPSs are action-based games as well. So here's what that looked like in Diablo 3. So here we have the 3-second rule, where I need to get out from taking damage. I've left the mouse cursor on in this video so you can kind of see what the player is doing. And you might pick up on the fact that there's not a lot for the player to do when they're running away from monsters. You know, I want to heal up, so I run away from the monsters, and then I just kind of move around in circles, you know, like a chicken with its head cut off. It's not exciting. It's not engaging. And most importantly, it's not fulfilling my fantasy. You know, this idea that I don't want to take damage, I want to heal some more, so I'm just going to back away and run around in circles. We got a lot of complaints about that during internal playtesting. So the lesson from that is the mechanics that we have are going to induce particular behaviors in players. We all know this to be true. But those behaviors that we induce, we want it to be fantasy fulfilling. Why does the 3-second regeneration rule work so well in first-person shooters? It's because hiding, lying prone, taking cover, going inside a room, these are all parts of my core fantasy in a first-person shooter game. But they're not part of my core fantasy in a top-down action RPG. So the lesson there is that just because a mechanic works in one genre of game doesn't necessarily mean you can port that, you know, mechanic directly over and hope that and expect it to work. So in this case, we had to continue to iterate. So in thinking about the next iteration, we have said, OK, we know that we want the mechanic to match the fantasy. If our fantasy is not running away from monsters and running around in circles for a long time, what is it? And really, it's killing enemies. And that's what got us to health globes. The idea here was, maybe if I need to heal, my best course of action is to get farther into combat, kill some more monsters, hope for a health globe drop, and collect it. And for those of you who played, you know that that's the system that we ultimately shipped with. We're very happy with it. Here's what it looks like in combat. So I have some damage. I want to heal. So I kill some monsters. Boop, out comes a health globe. And I just walk over and pick it up, and then I heal back up to full. Huge success. We were very happy with the pacing that achieved all of our goals. It was fantasy fulfilling. It also allowed us to limit monster damage 3 to 5 seconds before you went from full to dead, as well as giving the player the opportunity to heal back up. While we're on the topic, and this is a little bit of an aside, a lot of people ask me, hey Wyatt, is the health globe drop rate truly random in Diablo 3? Or are you guys cheating a little bit? You know, are you guys normalizing out the rates? Are you looking at how much health I have and dropping a globe for me when I'm kind of low? And I'll just say, we're not. You know, it's a true random system. We talked about doing stuff like that, but we ultimately decided that sometimes those random fluctuations are actually really good for the game. I mean, at the end of the day, you still have health potions, and you still have skills and items, so we wanted to make sure that some of that drama and those peaks and valleys and the combat pacing still existed, and the Health Globe seemed to create that pretty organically, so we were happy with that. So what did we learn from the health recovery system? Well, like I said, we put in a potion dilution scaler in the beginning, even though we weren't sure if it was going to work. A lot of that's just when you don't know what to do, just experiment, iterate. Let your team know that this is going to be an experiment. Those are really useful. We have to limit healing so that we can limit the damage. And that's how we create this canvas for tactical combat. And like I said, the game mechanics should fulfill the fantasy. So that establishes a backdrop for this tactical combat that we wanted. So the next question is, if now that the monsters are doing less damage and the player has some time to move around, I alluded to earlier the idea that we want multiple skills. We want these crowd control skills. We wanted skills that would reduce, monster damage or debuff, things that were very hard to create in a system with health potions. And that leads me to the second system that I want to talk about, which is command input. So before I get too far into this, I just want to preface by saying that I could talk about controls all day. I love geeking out about controls. I think that really tight controls are hard to do well, and a lot of my favorite games, unanimously have tight controls in them. But as we look at Diablo 3, we knew that we were going to have 6 skills available to you on the hotbar. And this seemed pretty straightforward at first. You can see in the shot, some skills are bound to 1, 2, 3, 4, left mouse button and right mouse button. But we immediately started to run into some problems during development. And this was this idea of lost clicks. And this plagued us during large parts of internal development. Because players play Diablo 3 very frenetically. You're constantly clicking, you're constantly issuing commands to the game, and a lot of times you're entering multiple keystrokes as well as mouse commands all at once. But your character has to animate. And animation is a very key part of making you feel connected to your character. I issue a command, the command is received by the game, my character performs an animation, and then I get the result. So how do we handle the input when the player is telling us lots of things at once? Before we go into that problem too much, let's go over the animation structure. So all of our combat animations involve, an animation usually between 18 and 28 frames long, which have 3 important points: the start frame, the contact frame, and the end frame. The start frame is our way of letting the user know that your command has been received and we're now going to perform the power. One of the things I want to call out about the start frame is it is an extreme pose. If you look at the barbarian and the full sequence of the animation that he's going to go through, it's the strongest silhouette, and it's because when the player clicks that button and the animation begins, normally in a lot of classical animation, you have what's called anticipation at the beginning of the animation. An analogy would be in console platformers. Game industry figured out pretty fast that you don't want your character to bend his knees, and wind up a jump, because it just doesn't feel responsive to have that delay before my character actually starts traveling through the air. Well, we found the same thing for Diablo 3, is for the controls to feel really responsive, we skip and cut out huge parts of the anticipation, go straight to an extreme silhouette, strong silhouette extreme pose, so that you get that immediate feedback. User, we got your command and we're performing the power. And that's what increases that sense of control. So from the start frame, you then begin animating through to the contact frame, which is always located for us between a quarter and a third way into the animation. We tried other positions, and we really felt like that was the best compromise between giving the weapon some weight versus feeling like you got your impact out. The contact frame is when, if I'm a melee attack, I actually make contact with the enemy and hit. It's if I'm a ranged attack, that's when the projectile actually comes out. If I'm a caster, that's when the buff goes off. And then that time from the contact through to the end, that's the follow-through. That's where the animators have time to communicate a lot of weight in the weapon. That's where your attack speed really comes into play if you have a slow versus fast weapon. And all of that happens from the contact through to the end. As a side note, that's also when we then allow the player to move, which is another iteration that we did, which I don't go into too much detail on, but we found that players really enjoyed that ability to stutter step their animations through, so we allow movement after the contact frame. So let's get back to the original problem. The player now has the ability to issue up to 6 commands all at once. 1, 2, 3, 4, left mouse button, right mouse button. So for the purposes of illustration today, I'm going to focus on 4 skills that I'm going to use as examples: Magic Missile, Arcane Orb, Blizzard, and Ice Armor. So that first skill, like I said, is Magic Missile. Here's a video of what that looks like. Magic Missile is a single target skill, shoots a fairly fast projectile, hits one enemy, and has no resource cost. This skill is Arcane Orb. It shoots a slower projectile that does area of effect damage and has a high resource cost. So you can kind of see there's different reasons why, as a player, I might want to cast one versus the other. The third skill is Blizzard. I go through my animation. Upon hitting the contact frame, ice begins to fall from the sky, and then my character is free to do other things after that contact frame, and ice will continue to fall from the sky for a couple seconds and do damage to an area. And the last skill is Ice Armor. This one's a buff. I go through my animation. I cast a buff on myself. That buff is represented by that large shell of ice that you see forming around the wizard. That's in response to me casting Ice Armor. While I have that buff on me, if a monster swings at me, it's frozen. There's a great feeling of power as a player when a monster walks up and it's just frozen in its tracks like that, and you're not even doing anything. You don't even have to do an animation once the buff is on you. So let's get to this problem, back to the problem of lost clicks. First thing we did is we divided all of our powers into primary animation powers and secondary animation powers. And that distinction was pretty quick to make. The idea here is a primary animation power really wants to play its animation. In fact, if you can't play your animation, then the power is going to fail. This really tied into anything that's going to do damage in particular, like your normal attacks, your swings, your magic missiles and stuff. Because if I don't animate and a projectile still comes out, then that's going to feel really weird. It's going to feel like, I'm not going to feel as connected, and the combat's not going to feel as visceral. So the animation is really important. A secondary animation power, on the other hand, is one where we felt like, you know what? If we can't play the animation, that's kind of OK. We can still have the power go off. So we tied some very loud, strong visual effects to all of our secondary animation powers so that even if you were currently animating something else, we could have the power go off, the particle effects go off to communicate that we've received your command and executed on it, but we don't interrupt what you're currently doing. And we also don't allow the power to fail. Here's what that looks like. So of the 4 skills, Ice Armor is a secondary animation power, because it's a buff, and we're OK if you don't animate. So here, I'm running around, and every time that blue shell goes off, I'm casting Ice Armor. So you can kind of see that we still let the player run around and cast Ice Armor. I could even be attacking while I'm casting Ice Armor. Here I am casting some magic missiles, and Ice Armor goes off every time the player clicks the spell. So the result of that, again, very good. We consider that experiment a success. Improved controls for the player. And some people would argue that there is a slight increase in power for the players because, hey, before I had to kind of stop moving to cast Ice Armor. And isn't that part of the gameplay of keeping up a 2-minute buff? Is that opportunity cost of standing still? And our ultimate conclusion was that the feeling of these lost clicks and really feeling in control of your character was more important than tying in that animation and that slight increase in power that we were giving to the players. So while this was good and it improved the number of reports of lost clicks that we were getting, it still doesn't address all the skills that do need to animate, and that was the other 3. So we took a look at those. The first thing we tried is interrupting powers. And the idea here is if I issue a whole bunch of commands, just perform the last command that was executed by the user. This kind of makes sense at an intuitive level, because if I'm pushing a whole bunch of buttons, there's probably a skill right at the end that I pressed. If I cast like Magic Missile, Arcane Orb, and then bam, I'm hammering on Blizzard, I kind of really expect Blizzard to come out. So why don't you just stop what you're doing and do that power instead? And here's what that would look like in action. So this video is slowed down by down to a third at 33% speed, so you can kind of see the interruption and process. So these are just some reference shots, Magic Missile and Arcane Orb. So here's Arcane Orb as it goes out. But now watch as Magic Missile and Arcane Orb are allowed to interrupt each other. As Magic Missile is finishing up, between the contact frame and the end frame, before it's completely finished, the user issues the next command, and we just immediately respond. We cut off the rest of the animation and begin the new power. And here's Arcane Orb being interrupted by Magic Missile. The result is improved controls. That's kind of to be expected. If I push a button, that skill is guaranteed to go off. So we really like that aspect, and it was showing a lot of promise. The downside is, as some of you may have guessed, it does result in the opportunity for some increased DPS on the player, which of course we always have to evaluate how much increased power are we giving versus the sense of control. It was kind of negative in this case because it also created what I call a burden of optimal play. This is the idea that the player can increase their power level, but they do so in a way that's not necessarily enjoyable. I mean, although I can get extra frames of animations trimmed off of my skill to do more damage, I have to stare at my character really carefully and carefully time and take latency into account and all these other factors that didn't seem very appealing. But more importantly, I could also still lose some commands if the command was issued before the contact frame. So let's take a look at what those two problems look like. So here's an example of how a player could increase their DPS. And you can kind of see by weaving arcane orbs and Magic Missile back and forth, I can actually cut off all the time from the contact frame through to the end frame and get almost twice as many projectiles out as I could before. Remember, though, this is at 33% playback speed, so you can kind of imagine what this must be like to play, at full speed. That's a burden of optimal play. But the bigger problem was this problem. If I clicked before the contact frame, I didn't get my projectile. You can kind of see the wizard's interrupting herself, so nothing comes out. And this was a huge problem. And we were like, we can't ship like this. Like, I'm spamming Magic Missile and Arcane Orb and nothing is coming out. So we knew we had to try something else. So the next idea we tried is this idea of a command queue. And this is actually pretty common in a lot of games, both MMOs, action RPGs in general, is that you queue a lot of commands. And we were a little bit apprehensive about this for two reasons. The first reason is that at a point in time, we were already in beta. We had tried the interrupting method that I just mentioned, had actually gone out to the public during the beta test. And and a lot of players had picked up on this optimal DPS problem, and we were in complete feature lockdown because we were trying to hit a ship date, and there has to be that time where you're just polishing all the systems you have and you're wrapping it up and you want to get the game out the door. But the team believes in tight controls. So when we sat down and we really evaluated how big of a deal we thought this was, at Blizzard we have one of our design values, control is king. And we had a discussion, and we said, you know what? Even if we have to delay the game, the controls must feel tight and responsive. We knew this to be the case because although a lot of other features could probably be cut or delayed or worked on later or pushed out, controls, it was unacceptable that we would go out with anything less than really tight controls. So that was our first concern. The second concern is that we had seen other games do command queuing, and sometimes it actually results in controls that feel worse. A lot of times when we had played some other action RPGs, your character ends up queuing a bunch of commands, and it actually feels like there's a loss of control. To use an extreme example, if you did full queuing, imagine I cast 5 Magic Missiles in a row by clicking really, really fast. I mean, I certainly wouldn't expect to be able to take my hands off the keyboard and my character still shoots 5 Magic Missiles out. I mean, that'd be ridiculous. You definitely feel like you actually had less control of your character at that point. So what we did is some queue windows. And those queue windows are very carefully tuned and have some rules surrounding them. The first rule is never queue more than one command at a time. This one almost seems obvious. This is the rule that most games implement pretty early on when you implement command queuing. So even if I click Magic Missile 5 times in a row, I'm going to queue the one that I'm currently doing, and I'll queue one more, and that's it. The second rule we have is that we only queue commands for a very brief time window. We tried different time windows from 0.1 seconds up to 1.0 seconds, and we really found that there's a sweet spot between 0.3 and 0.5 seconds is the amount of time that we feel like you want to hold on to that command and queue it. If you think about it from a qualitative standpoint, what you're really saying with your queue window is, how long ago could the player have asked the character to do something that when it comes out, you're not kind of surprised? And that feels like about 0.3 to 0.5 seconds, where you're like, yeah, I kind of cast Blizzard. I just did that. It should come out. That feels right. So all of our powers are set up with values between 0.3 and 0.45 seconds for the amount of time that they're allowed to queue. The last thing we had to do is what we have happen when the player actually does more than 2 commands, because we've already established we're not going to queue more than 1 command in advance. So what happens when multiple extra commands are issued? So how do you handle that? Well, the first rule, and I'll kind of give you some examples, if one is currently executing, the different command has priority. So to illustrate what that means, imagine again that I'm casting Magic Missile a lot. Missile, 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 missile. And then I insert an Arcane Orb command in the middle of that. Missile, missile, Arcane Orb, missile, missile, missile. And that's happening all the time in our game because players are spamming the left mouse button as fast as they can, and then they issue one of the other commands that they have. That command, because it was different than what's currently being done, is super important. The player expects that different command to happen. So it gets high priority in the queue and cannot be knocked off by any other future commands of Magic Missile until that Arcane Orb comes out. That's rule number 1. The other rule for handling 2 commands is if both of them are different than the currently executing command, then do the latest one. So again, use my Magic Missile example earlier. Missile, 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 Arcane Orb. Now the Arcane Orb is queued and it's locked in. Missile, 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 Blizzard. Well, which one do I do now, the Blizzard or the Arcane Orb? Because they're both different than the currently executing Magic Missile. In that case, you want to do the latest one. And that was sort of a lesson that we had picked up from that experiment that we did with interrupting powers earlier. I mean, what we did learn from interrupting powers is that the player does kind of have an association with the latest thing that they're doing. But the problem, if you remember from the interrupting powers, is you didn't want to interrupt what you're currently doing. So if you combine those ideas, then you want to do the latest thing, but you don't want to interrupt what's currently happening. Just queue it up within a reasonable time frame for the future. And this worked great. That's what we wound up shipping with. We had the primary and secondary animation powers. We had the command queuing with a lot of rules. You know, in general, we want to prioritize the most likely skill. What that means is like the skill that we think the user was actually trying to do. There's still some edge cases, mostly around movement powers like Whirlwind and Vault, where there's some client-server synchronization to try and really tighten up those controls, and we're still working on those. But overall, most of the other commands feel really good in the player's hands. What did we learn? Well, good controls are really hard to do. And this has been my experience on almost every game that I've worked on. If you're going to have really good controls, you know, there's going to be a lot of edge cases and a lot of special rules. In general, the rule you want to think about is what did the player intend to do? A lot of times I'm talking to our gameplay programmers and we're having this discussion and we'll say, hey, you know what, we should try, you know, especially if you think about those command queuing rules, there's a lot of special case rules in there. And they'll say, hey, Wyatt, like, why is this so complicated? I thought that like design values simplicity. Why is it so complicated? And you know, the realization we had is that designs are have to be simple from the user's point of view, because that's the part that they see. And sometimes you have a lot of complexity under the hood in order to present something simple to the user. And an example that I would put forth is like voice recognition. You know, voice recognition is super complicated under the hood, but the whole point is to present the simplest possible interface to the user. So now we've established that we have the ability to do a lot of different skills. We have the good combat pacing that we want. But what are the skills that I'm actually going to use? How does the player acquire them? And that leads us to the third system of 3 that we're going to talk about today. And you know, how does the player actually acquire skills? Before we get too far into this, I want to mention that the skill system ultimately, I feel, is not as important as the individual skills. If you have an amazing skill system and really lousy skills, it doesn't really matter. Players aren't going to play your game. But if you have great skills and kind of an awkward skill system, then people will probably see past the skill system because players spend most of their time actually using the skills. But designers like geeking out on skill systems. I love geeking out on skill systems. We just talk about them all day. And it's funny that even though the player doesn't use that much time interacting with your skill system directly, and they spend most of their time using them, we still like to talk about skill systems because they're interesting. And I think that they do evoke the imagination. And that's a compelling part of the experience. We started looking at Diablo 2, which exhibited all these positive properties. They're very evocative. It was aesthetically pleasing to look at the Diablo 2 skill tree. You could kind of try a bunch of different skills. It was very cool if you found a skill that you liked, like, I really like, Fireball, then I'm going to put 20 points into it and make it a lot better. That was a lot of fun. Unfortunately, it did have downsides, which a lot of successors or spiritual successors afterwards keyed into. The idea that it encouraged point hoarding. It was easy to make mistakes. And what I mean by easy to make mistakes, I'm not just talking about the fact that I click on something and then I accidentally spent a point. I mean, that could be solved with an undo or anything like that. I'm talking about the fact that I could take a skill and then regret that I took that skill 30 minutes later. And people will sometimes say, hey, well, how about better tooltips? Could better tooltips describe this? But of course, the longer your tooltip gets, the less likely people are going to read it. Not to mention, it doesn't even matter if you put a 1,000-word essay on the tooltip. That's not going to describe to the player how they're going to experience the skill. How about movies? We could play a little AVI file about what the skill is going to look like. We could create a test chamber or a playground where you can just kind of use the skill for a while before you commit. Unfortunately, what we found is all of these things just kind of delay the problem. Sometimes the player can have all this, but they don't really know that they want to use that skill until they've had it in a real combat situation and they've had a chance to use it to fight monsters in actual combat. And the other problem, the connections can be arbitrary because you're trying to create this aesthetic look. And sometimes that aesthetic look trumps the actual reason why you might have those dependencies. But the other big problem was analysis paralysis. This is the idea that I'm overwhelmed with all these choices. And we kind of felt like if I'm 3 minutes into your game, into Diablo 3, and I get my first skill point, and we pop open a tree with 30 choices, a lot of players are just overwhelmed. And it was kind of odd that 3 minutes into the game, you're torturing yourself over a choice about how you think you're going to want to play the game 30 hours from now. That seemed a little bit backwards for us. We wanted to try and delay as much of the hard decision making and skill building until after you've already had a chance to engage in the combat system. But nonetheless, we did use Diablo 2 as a starting point. And this is kind of an early shot of what a Diablo 3 skill tree looked like very early on. We tried a bunch of different iterations in which we just tried to simplify some of the dependencies or try different relationships. This was one of our early attempts at eliminating what I mentioned analysis paralysis before. So kind of early on, I only have 3 skills to choose from. We can make those choices very different. We're hiding the options that I have later. Of course, you think about it, people are just going to alt-tab out to look up all the skills on a website. But we tried it. This was kind of getting more looking at the World of Warcraft Cataclysm and before talent tree with the requirements 5, 10, 15, 20, kind of solving some of that point hoarding problem. Of course, this still has the analysis paralysis problem where there's just a lot of tooltips to read. This was kind of one of our refinements when we're trying to simplify things. Again, we're hiding some of the options, but the idea here is I take a skill, and that's a more significant choice, and then that leads me down the road to maybe some other choices, some other skills later that are in a more linear progression. This is the same idea in a different layout. Again, just exploring this idea that I have a skill and it's evolving over time. And that's what really led us to this system here, which is the idea here is, as I leveled up, we would grant you some skills, and those skills would have 3 choices. And you can kind of see on the screen there's some different icons, and those icons represented, at the time, some very simplistic effects. You know, there's a damage increaser, there's a critical strike increaser, there's a range increaser. Each of these were just simple number changes on the base skill. And we really kind of liked this iteration. We were like, hey, I really like getting a skill, getting to use it for a while, and then being able to choose one of 3 different numbersy effects that I would like to modify the skill. And that's where the runestone system came in. And the runestone, early runestone, we actually had 10 different runestones. We took all the different effects from that previous iteration and translated them into 10 different runes. And each of those runes had a specific quality about the skill that it would change. I still acquired the skills. In this particular version, I still kind of made a few choices. We kind of went back and forth a lot. Made a few choices about what skills I wanted, but then I could go out in the world, find a rune, socket it in, and modify my skill. We played around with what that would look like in the inventory, because once we made them items, we really wanted these things to feel fun to manipulate. You know, we wanted these runes to be something I could pick up, feel like they were real, they're real, crunchy, like they feel solid, and like actual objects that I'd want to manipulate. So we played around a lot with some inventory management ideas of what it would be like to handle these runes to make them have some ceremony around them. So what do we like about the runestones? Well, as you can imagine, there was a lot of variety. You know, I have all these skills available, I've got 10 runes, and there's this sense of discovery. I mean, even though the designer had sat down and designed all 10 runes and all the skills, and we know what all the relationships are going to be, there's still something very personal about feeling, I took the striking rune and stuck it into Magic Missile, and here's the effect that comes out, and there's a certain sense of like, I did that, and it's a little bit of an illusion, but you definitely got that emotional sense. Like there was just a lot out there in the world to discover. What was bad is, another catchphrase, designing to a number. And this happens a lot when you have an aesthetic or a structure, and then you kind of have to fill it in. And sometimes you're stretching your system farther than it needs to go. If you look back at the Diablo 2 skill system, it had the 3 trees, and every tree had 10 skills. And sometimes that designing to a number means that you're filling in with a couple skills which maybe aren't as strong, but you got to have 10. In our case, we had 10 runes. And some of those runes didn't make sense with some of the skills. But because of the system we had designed, every rune we felt had to pair with one of the other skills. So what we did is we condensed it down. So again, we want these runes to feel like these really appealing items that I want to handle and manipulate. So we gave them names: Crimson, Indigo, Obsidian, Alabaster, Golden. These were runes that were very welcoming. They were kind of warm. I'd want to touch them and manipulate them. But they had themes associated with them. These were no longer promises like lethality or critical hit or damage. These were just general themes associated with each rune. And what we liked about this is what I call concentrated coolness. The idea that sometimes less is more. So whereas before we had 10 effects and we had the need to design to a number, here we were down to 5 effects, and the designers could sit down and just create a modification for every skill that made sense for that skill. So here's a shot of what our early runestone systems looked like. I have skills. Actually, it's funny, in this one I think there's 7 skills. Yeah, so we had 7 skills at one point that you could have at once. And you could grab these runestones, socket them into your skills, and you still had that sense of discovery, and that sense of like, I did that, the sense of wonder and exploration. Oh, gee, I wonder what this rune is going to do when I put it into this skill. Here's what it looked like in action. This video is from some of our QA archives. So here I'm using the electrocute skill, and I'm blasting some enemies. I open up my inventory, I socket in the indigo rune, and now my electrocute can bounce. If I want, remember how I said earlier the pairings were no longer forced? The designer could just do something cool. So I put an obsidian rune, and we really want to just have this fantasy of lightning coming out of my fingertips. So rather than being constrained by those very definite words in the 10 rune system, here we had these more abstract concepts with 5 runes where we could just do cool stuff. And here electrocute turns into piercing bolts, where I can just kind of shoot out lots of lightning bolts in rapid succession. The result of that was great. You know, we were having a lot of fun. We could design runes that made sense. You know, the less is more philosophy. We didn't need 10 rune stones. We just needed 5, and we could choose the best 5 that we really liked for every skill. But there were still some problems. The first is that a lot of times the player has in mind a skill that they really want to do, you know, like a skill build that we want to put together, but then they had to rummage through their inventory, and players would keep tons of these rune stones in their inventory and stash and to get the build that they know exists and they have in mind. The other problem is that flexibility for the designer to just design a rune stone and skill pairing that made sense actually worked against us when it didn't match the player expectations. I mean, if I have an indigo rune and I kind of got the idea that the indigo rune means multiplicity, and then I put it into a skill and something cold or lightning happens instead, you know, I could be really disappointed about what I get. And it didn't have a lot of sense, and we also felt like we were missing out on the flavor opportunity. And that flavor opportunity was that these runes, although had these generic names, could have really benefited from having specific names that were tied to the skill. And that's what led us finally to the system that we shipped with. But, you know, if you play the game now, you can still kind of see these remnants of the old skill system. So, like, here's a shot of the Demon Hunter on the first tier. You can kind of see that as I get to higher levels, I'm going to unlock new skills. I'm going to unlock new runes. But if you look at Entangling Shot, here Entangling Shot's a skill that's going to hit 2 enemies and slow them. And you can kind of go through the runes. I mean, there's the Indigo rune with multiplicity, you know, hitting more targets. This is Obsidian with an electric theme going on, shock collar. Alabaster had a slow theme, so you can kind of still see that rune, you know, coming through in the end. Golden had an efficiency theme. You can kind of see this with cheaper shots. And Crimson rune had a life-stealing theme, and here that's the Bounty Hunter rune. So you can still kind of see that the runes still carried forward, you know, spiritually, but they were given flavorful names that were able to better match and, you know, were a lot more appropriate for each of the skills. So what do we learn after all this iteration over the skill system? Well, this is a general rule in systems design that I've learned in general, is solve the most important problems first. I mean, if we had just identified very early on what problems were the most important to us, and you sat us down, we would have said, you know what? We need fun skills, we need to solve analysis paralysis, and we need to let players experiment around with their skills. And we could have probably saved ourselves a lot of iteration time on some of those earlier iterations if we had identified these as the most important problems that we really wanted to solve. But we didn't, you know, and like I said, we were geeking out with a bunch of skill systems. But we, you know, got through the iterations and figured out the system that eventually shipped. So to recap the talk that we went over today, we talked about the health system, talked about how, you know, if the damage is very high, then the healing can be very high, and those two are really just two sides of the same coin. We really want mechanics that match your fantasy, no matter what your game is. Make sure that it's appropriate for the genre. We learned that, you know, good controls are hard, you know, especially like the simpler it seems sometimes to the player, the harder it is sometimes under the hood. Special case rules when it comes to controls, sometimes that's just a fact. And the skill system, you know, at the end of the day, we should have spent more time making more individual skills. I'm glad that we were able to have the time that we did. They actually developed in parallel, where we developed the skill system at the same time that we were developing skills. So that kind of worked out in the end. But we definitely want to solve the most important problems first. And that applies no matter what system that you're working on. So that wraps it up. Thank you very much. Thank you. Looks like we have about 10 or 12 minutes for questions. There's a mic over here and a mic over there.
Hi, I have 2 questions. The first one is about balancing. So Diablo 3 is a PvE game, but you're adding in the brawling and the team fight feature. So when you design the classes and the skills, how do you balance those two parts? Like at one time, the game feels like World of Barbarian, but when you fight in the brawling, it feels like monks are overpowered. So how do you balance those classes and skills? And the second one is about, should I ask later?
Yeah, we'll just do one question per person right now. So if the question's about balancing and how do we handle it, particularly with taking into consideration PvP, PvE, class balance, and so forth, I mean, that really comes down to like the core values for the game. And I would say, one of the values that we identified very early on is this sense that your character is powerful and you have visceral combat, and that the combat itself would be tactical and engaging, kind of been a theme going through my talk. So design's always about trade-offs, right? And if we had to weigh PvP balance versus your character feeling powerful, then your character feeling powerful is going to win. And sometimes that's a spectrum. It's never a black and white thing. But we, on Diablo 3, really knew we wanted to push that. So anytime it was visceral combat versus almost anything else, then we would choose in that direction to make sure that we were doing that well. If it was a different game, then you might choose different things. It just depends on the values of the project.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. So when you were talking about health recovery, you mentioned that it was truly random when those health globes would appear. And currently in Diablo 3, like if you kill a bunch of enemies or destroy a bunch of objects, you get an XP bonus for that. And I was just wondering if you guys ever considered kind of connecting a mass kill to getting a health globe or anything like that, and moving away from it just being totally random so that the player is rewarded for, a huge kill beyond just a small XP reward. Like
a kill streak bonus? Yeah. Honestly, I don't think we've ever really talked about that. It's an interesting idea. The health globes, I should qualify the health globe statement when I say that they're random. They are based like random per monster and in aggregate. So for example, a lot of monsters will have a 20% chance to drop a health globe, but certainly, we have the ability to say, well, this monster is going to be 100%, or this one's definitely going to drop at 50%. So it is like a genuine roll, but that roll is going to depend on the monster. In terms of whether or not we tied that into the kill streak bonus, I mean, we hadn't. The kill streak bonus was really intended to just feel like a bonus and to be like an attaboy. Congratulations on your kill streak bonus. I mean, I guess it's something we consider in general. I'm a little bit more skeptical when the systems become interdependent too much. It's certainly worth considering, but my initial reaction would be to try and keep each system focused on solving one problem.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks.
Hi, I have a question on the skill system.
Yeah.
Specifically, the experimentation aspect of it. So one great thing about the system in Diablo 3 is, you get the new skill, get the new rune, you're like, immediately I can test this out in real combat, see how it plays, But one of the things you sort of lose with the, I guess in a sense, basically there's no real sort of permanence to your character.
Sure, yeah.
You kind of lose like the standard RPG, I identify this as a hammered in or whatever.
Yeah.
So was that that wasn't one of your major things on your list, but what was kind of the consideration of that when you were developing the skill system?
Yeah, no, totally. Like I was alluding to earlier. So I guess the question is about whether the trade-offs on the skill system and what we gain in flexibility for the player, we lose in a sense of permanence or possibly investment in the character, or being able to identify with a particular build and feeling invested in that. And we did lose some of that. That's the reality, right? It's in the sense of trade-offs. And when we were designing the skill system, we definitely looked at it and said, we have, I mean, if you think about it, each class having between 20 and 25 skills with 5 rune variants is a lot of possibilities. And we wanted players to be able to experiment with those, but we did lose in this other area. So I think if we were going to try and address permanence, I probably wouldn't do it by modifying the skill system itself, but rather looking for other ways for players to feel a little bit more invested in their character. I mean, since, like you said, that is something that was diminished. So just trade-offs. Yes.
Hello. My question kind of ties into that just a little bit. But I feel with Diablo 2, there was a heavy focus on tying items into skills, and that was an important aspect of the game, it is there a little bit in Diablo 3, but not very much.
Right, yeah. So how do items tie in?
I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Because I feel that added some level of depth that is
yes, absolutely.
For the player, having the systems connected.
Right, the interaction of items. And so, again, like sitting down with Diablo 3, we had to sit down and really think about the skill system and the rune system. And as it started to take shape, we knew that it was new. And we knew that not a lot of games had really done something like it before. So we really wanted to sort of double down on the skill system and deliver something that players would immediately say, wow, that skill system is awesome. I mean, I wish that there was more permanence, but the skill system is awesome. Or the skill system is awesome, and I wish items were more interesting, but the skill system is awesome. So we kind of knew that we were investing heavily into one system. I mean, if you take it in aggregate, you sort of have this like budget of interesting effects that you could do, and we could have taken any of the skill runes, like your entangling shot hits 4 targets, and rather than being a rune effect, it could have very well been a legendary item, right? And that goes for any rune effect, could have been an item instead. And so the question is, like, given that you have this creative budget of cool effects to have in your skills, how are you going to spend that? And we decided, you know what, we're going to invest heavily in the skill system. Looking at the game as a whole now, I think that we need to now turn an eye towards the items and legendaries, and I think we could do a lot better there. And that's definitely, like, plans for the future would include that.
Right.
Yeah.
I very much enjoyed the game, so thank you for that.
Awesome.
I was just, it's not so much about, what I meant was not so much about making either system cool, but that there can be a depth from the system interacting with each other.
Yeah, and so I hope that we will be able to do some of that in the future, where now that we've sort of established the skill system as what it is, it's pretty cool, it has strengths, it has weaknesses, how can we design now, how can we further flesh out the item game to complement and support that? I think you kind of see echoes of that idea in like the 300th Spear, just this idea that it has the possibility to make certain skills better. Maybe if I'm going to be a throw barbarian, then I really want this item. I think we could kind of take that and take that idea much farther.
Thank you.
So. Yes?
It seems like you guys fleshed out the health globe system a lot, but then why did you feel the need to include like life on hit and life on kill? And specifically with life on kill, why does that not need to be normalized with like monster size or affected during boss battles? Did you just think it was okay to have that be sort of useless in a lot of the boss battles?
Okay, so the question is, we spent a lot of time on the health globe system. We got combat into a pacing range that we were happy with, but as the game extends out farther, it seems to become eclipsed or sometimes like relevant or sometimes not relevant in various situations. Is that kind of, and with interaction with life on hit or life steal? Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it translates well as it could in the end game, to be honest. I think that that's another area that we'd be looking at. We definitely want your items to matter. We definitely want you to be able to feel an investment in your gear. And we're constantly looking for new item affixes that I could roll on an item, and we really want those affixes to be, compelling. I think one of the conflicts we have is it's very easy to make damage-related affixes interesting, like, obviously attack speed or critical damage and critical hit and stuff like that. And so we're always really excited when we can have other orthogonal properties like, movement speed or life on hit and stuff like that. So I wouldn't want to move away from life on hit, but yeah, to incorporate it, particularly as you get farther into the game. I guess farther in the game, I would like health globes to remain more consistently useful and life on hit to complement it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, probably.
Hi, Hi, I'm just kind of curious about how you guys design for expansion packs ahead of time. Since you do a lot of, for example, in Diablo 2, you guys did the synergies. Do you plan ahead of time, knowing that the changes you're making now are eventually going to be either negated by changes in an expansion, or do you just change things out of necessity based on feedback?
Do we change things based on feedback, and how much do we plan for expansions?
Well, so sort of like, I mean, there's constant patches with like balancing and stuff. Or do you design the expansion pack based on what you think it's going to need eventually, or what it, or I guess, is it less of a community like feedback thing, or more of like we need to improve this system?
I don't think there's like a black and white answer to any of those. You know, like when it comes to an expansion in general, when we're shipping the game, we just, you know, we want to ship the game. And we usually, you know, there can be issues, there can be things to think about. It's also interesting sort of how game development has changed today versus, you know, even 5, 10 years ago, where there is, you know, a little more, I think, expectation of live support than there was 10 years ago in games, especially online games. But at the end of the day, we do have the values and the experience that we're trying to create. So when we get feedback from players or through the community, if the suggestions are in line with the values and the experience that we want to deliver, then great. Obviously, you know, since design is, I think, you know, I know I've said it a bunch, but design is about trade-offs. So it can't, one game can't be everything to everyone, and everyone would love to see it go in different directions. But yeah, I mean, if there's a fantastic suggestion that we think meets a lot of our design goals, then we would absolutely, you know, look at it and talk about it and discuss it. So, awesome. Thank you very much for coming.